Okay, so we're going to talk about one of the oldest problems in philosophy. They're all old, but you know, this one's one of the oldest, which is a puzzle about whether or not we have free will. There are various challenges to us having free will, one of which that I've mentioned but we're not going to talk about now, is whether or not God being able to know what you're going to do in advance stops you having free will. That's an interesting puzzle in itself. But the one we're going to look at is whether or not determinism means that we do not have free will. So first of all, I'll say what determinism is, and then I'll say why we should care about this. Something I'm sure you're wondering. Okay, so determinism is the idea that basically the universe is ordered and it follows rules. And determinism is something that is assumed by classic science. You know, the kind of science that Locke was just getting going under when Locke was writing, that he was so enthused about. Descartes as well. The kind of science that Newton's laws describe. And it's around the time of when modern science is really getting going, when we're discovering all of these laws that the universe seems to follow that allow us to make incredibly accurate predictions, that this puzzle starts to recur. It originally occurred back in the time of the ancient Greeks, as with most things in philosophy. And the ancient Greeks had remarkably sophisticated models of the universe. The ancient Greeks knew, for example, not only that the Earth was round, but they had a pretty accurate measurement of the diameter of the Earth. They worked it out amazingly well. Because you can see the curvature of the Earth, and they measured it. But when it really flourished again is when Newton was producing all these laws that enabled us to predict sort of the movement of the planets and so on. Yeah, so determinism seems to be true because it allows us to do amazing things in science. Just this week, for example, we landed another rover on Mars. And Mars, relative to the Earth, is tiny and very far away. So think of, and it takes a long time for us to get the rover there, and we only have so much fuel, so we have to know where Mars is going to be a long time in advance so we can make sure that the rocket goes there. Instead, we can't just point the rocket at Mars and set it going, because Mars is, of course, moving and moving in ways that are not immediately clear to someone like me, because Mars is rotating and its orbit is affected by the other planets and so on. So it's very sophisticated. And yet, NASA can do things like this because it knows the laws that Mars and the planets are following. So they do follow laws. Things act predictably. Okay, so what? Well, according to the idea behind determinism, if you know the complete state of the universe at any moment, and if you knew all of the laws of the universe, you could predict with perfect accuracy the complete state of the universe at any time in its entire history, for millions of years in the future, millions of the years in the past. If you know at any of those moments the laws of physics and the complete state of the universe, then you will know the entire history of the universe, because you will know exactly what's going to happen, exactly what has happened. So essentially, there is only one possible outcome given the state of the universe at any moment and the laws of the nature. Again, what's this got to do with us? Well, it means that for us, there is only one possible thing that we could do at any moment in our existence. We don't know what it is because we don't understand the laws of physics in great enough detail. But if determinism is right, there is someone who knew the complete state of the universe millions of years ago could have predicted that I would raise my hand right now. In fact, I had to. There was no possibility that I wouldn't. The laws of physics determined that. Okay. This is because, of course, we're made of the same stuff that Mars is made of. I'm made of atoms that, as I've said, are as old as the universe. We're all made of stardust, literally, because that's where atoms come from. So we're made of exactly the same stuff that Mars is made of, just arranged slightly differently. And the atoms that make up us have to obey the laws of physics just as much as the atoms that make up Mars and the Mars rover. So our actions, in theory, are perfectly predictable. Well, now I think you see the challenge, because we tend to think that free will requires choice. Now, we say that we have free will. In fact, free will seems to be very important to us. A lot of people say us having free will is what separates us from the other animals, that we can choose to do things. And this is important because it seems to be what gives us responsibility. So, for example, the reason why it would be stupid to put a shark on trial for biting a surfer is because we think the shark had to do that. The shark, we are perfectly okay with saying the shark just follows instincts and is just an animal, and it's like a complicated biological machine that has to behave the way that it does. So of course it's going to bite the surfer. It's not as if it had a choice in the matter. It just, sharks do that. So even though actually there are in the history of all sorts of countries, including the United States, cases where they have put animals on trial. For example, a pig ate a child once because the child fell into its pigsty, and they put it on trial. I love to have been at that trial. I mean, it would be upsetting, but it would be kind of interesting. You know, that we laugh at that because that seems ridiculous. It seems like you don't put a pig on trial because they didn't have a choice in the matter, which reveals that we feel like having a choice in the matter is what makes us responsible for our actions. And that's what makes them morally good or morally bad. For example, everybody has heard, I imagine, of Tourette's syndrome, which is this condition where you do certain things involuntarily. So often you twitch involuntarily. One variant of Tourette's, which is fairly uncommon, but it does exist, is when you will involuntarily say obscene words. Literally, people will do this. They'll be walking down the street and they will yell an obscene word at the top of their voice, and they have no control over this. This is just a feature of their brains. They can't stop themselves. So suppose they do this in a place where it is illegal to swear. Should they be punished or fined for swearing? I think just about everybody would say no. Why? Because they can't help it. They didn't have a choice in the matter. Well, here's the challenge. According to determinism, if determinism is true, it looks like none of us ever have a choice about what we do, because we have to do what we do because the laws of nature determine it. I mean, after all, we don't think that we can disobey the laws of nature in most respects. If I jump off a building, I don't think to myself, well, now I'll just choose not to fall. I will choose to disobey the law of gravity. Well, good luck with that, you know. You will be a splat on the sidewalk. So we know we can't disobey the laws of physics in that respect, so why should we think we can disobey them in any other respect? It's just as much guaranteed by the laws of nature that I would raise my hand now that it is that I would fall when I jump off the building. So, where does this get us? Well, in the readings that I've given you for this unit, he divides, this is Robert Kane, he divides groups, the groups of theories according to whether they're incompatibilist or compatibilist. So compatibilists are theories that say that you can have both free will and determinism. And we'll look at classic compatibilism in a second. This is the view of the great British philosophers Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, David Hume, and John Stuart Mill. So I find this view very congenial because, you know, I guess it was part of my national heritage. Although Hume is Scottish, as I'm sure he would tell you if he were alive today. But let's start with an incompatibilist view. And this view is called hard determinism. And hard determinism is the view that determinism is true and that therefore we don't have free will. We don't have free will because they are incompatible. You can only have one, and according to the hard determinists, we have determinism. We must have determinism because otherwise science wouldn't work and Newton's laws wouldn't be as amazing as they are. So I'm going to give you a quote from Holbach. He says, "The inward persuasion that we are free to do or not to do a thing is a mere illusion." That is the inward persuasion, that is the belief that we have. Because we all have it. I think I don't have to raise my hand. I feel no compulsion. It's up to me. So he says, okay, this feeling that we have is a mere illusion. If we trace the true principle of our actions, we shall find that they are always necessary consequences of our volitions and our desires, which are never in our power. So, for example, you know, why do you eat that sandwich? Well, because you're hungry. Did you choose to be hungry? No, that's just something that happens to you. And did you choose to eat that sandwich? No, you didn't choose to. So it looks like the ultimate cause of what you think of as your choice is something that is not in your control. You think yourself free because you do what you will, what you choose to do. But are you free to will or not to will, to desire or not to desire? Are not your volitions and desires necessarily excited by objects or qualities totally independent of you? Yes, is the answer he would give. So this is the classic view that says we don't have free will. Now, what are the implications of this? The implications of this are sketched in the chapter in the Philosophy Files, which of course is called "Does Murderous Mick Deserve to be Punished?" And it looks like it's unfair to punish murderous Mick for doing what he does, just as much as it's unfair to fine someone with Tourette's for swearing, because in both cases there's nothing he could have done to avoid it. It's not his fault that he was born such that the laws of physics determined that he would kill someone. That's not his fault. And you see hints of this kind of thing being used literally as a defense in courts of law. There was a case of it, a very famous case. This is fictionalized in a movie called Rope, by the director Alfred Hitchcock, whom you might have heard of. Alfred Hitchcock, one of the great directors of thrillers. This one, and it has Jimmy Stewart in it, who you also might have heard of from It's a Wonderful Life. So this movie Rope, which is largely famous because it looks like it's all one unbroken take. They did it before that. What was that recent movie, 1917 or something, where they did the same thing? Well, Hitchcock did it years before. Anyway, it's a fictionalized version of a famous case called the Leopold and Loeb murders. Leopold and Loeb were two rich kids who read the philosopher Nietzsche and decided that they were going to be what Nietzsche described as Superman and above morality, and they decided to kill someone to prove it. And they did. They killed a child, I think. And they got caught because they were not Supermen. But the great defense attorney, Clarence Darrow, who's also famous, probably even more famous for the Scopes monkey trial case, look it up, he defended it by basically using a hard determinist argument, saying that they couldn't help it. It's not, they had no choice to be the kind of people they are. And in general, we might say the same about people we call psychopaths today. They are a certain kind of people who don't appear to feel empathy and are therefore, we would think, very dangerous because they don't respond to rules in the same way that non-psychopaths do. Okay, so you can see the implications for something like punishment. But also, it seems like this does rob our life of a lot of things that we value. For example, suppose you have trained for years to become a great guitarist, and then you play a brilliant rendition of Stairway to Heaven in the guitar shop. You figure out you deserve praise for that. Well, no, you don't deserve praise for that any more than you deserve praise for the color of your eyes or for having the shape of ears that you have. It's just a byproduct of the laws of nature. If hard determinism is correct. So, you know, it kind of robs your life of a lot of value. So that's hard determinism, and it's an incompatibilist view. Now we're going to sort of bounce back and forward between incompatibilist and compatibilist. The next view that we'll look at is classic compatibilism. And according to classic compatibilism, and this is the view, as I said, of Locke, whom we've read a lot of, probably most famously Hume and Mill. And Mill is famous for writing something called On Liberty, and a lot of the people who defend the First Amendment in the United States use arguments from Mill. He famously gave arguments in defense of free speech and things like that. Okay, he was a compatibilist. And the compatibilists make this claim. They say, look, once you understand what freedom is, you will see that it is in fact not incompatible with determinism. So the classic compatibilist view. They say freedom is the power to do what you want, which sounds right. That explains why we value it, because we like to do what we want. But then the second point, the second thing to state is this is only restricted by the things that we're familiar with restricting freedom, by coercion, restraint, manipulation. So in other words, Mill points this out. He says, look, if you believe the hard determinist, then there's literally no difference between me doing what I want and me being blown along by the wind. But Mill says, obviously, there's a difference. And we compatibilists can tell you what the difference is. When you're doing what you want, you are literally free. When you're being forced to do something against your will, then you're not free. So this is a distinction that we're familiar with, and this is one that the compatibilists can make. So I'm going to call this the control condition. That is, what the classic compatibilists stress is that what we value about freedom is being in control of our own actions. When we're not in control of our own actions, because we're being forced to do something we don't want, or because we've been brainwashed, or whatever, then we are not in control, and then we're not free. But, say the classic compatibilists, this is perfectly compatible with determinism. And in fact, they would make a stronger point. They would say this requires determinism. That is, if you think about doing what you want, suppose you say, I want to have a drink of water. So I think to myself, okay, where is there water? There it is. Okay, I'm going to pick it up. I'm going to open it. I'm going to take a swig. Did I do that freely? Sure, I say. Now, what made it possible for me to do that? Answer, that the laws of physics are uniform and I understand them. That it has to be the case that when my brain sends signals to my hand behaves in a predictable way. If there was just kind of randomness, if there were no laws of nature, then my brain could send signals to my hand and my hand could turn into a flower or something, if there was just no rhyme or reason to the way the universe behaves. So it's only because the universe behaves in an ordered and predictable way that I am able to do what I want. So determinism actually is necessary for me to be able to do what I want. And that's a good thing. Now, the other thing the classic compatibilists do, which you will see in the various chapters in the Robert Kane book, is they stress that you must not misunderstand what determinism is saying. And this is a point that's also made in the Stephen Law book. I'm going to write it over here. Determinism is not fatalism. That is, what the classic compatibilists say is, the reason why people get so bent out of shape about determinism is because they're misunderstanding what it's saying. They're confusing it with something called fatalism. Now, fatalism is the idea that there's no point in anything that I do because something's going to happen anyway. And I think a good illustration of a fatalist view is, even though I haven't seen these movies, I keep meaning to, the Final Destination movies. In the Final Destination movies, essentially, you're gonna die. You can't escape it. So I believe the plot of the first one is a bunch of people escape a plane crash or something, but they are fated to die. So because they didn't die as they were meant to in the plane crash, death stalks them and takes them out in various ingenious and gnarly ways. This is a fatalist view. That is, you can't escape your fate. If your fate is to die in this way, it will happen to you no matter what you do. And what determinism says, no, say that's stupid. What you do absolutely matters. This implies that you can't affect the world. And classic compatibilists say, of course you can affect the world. You are part of the universe. You are an object in the universe. Objects can affect other objects. Like one billiard ball can affect another billiard ball. You can affect lots of things. And you can affect them as a result of thinking and choosing to do something. So of course you can affect the world. Don't confuse it with fatalism. All right, so that's hard determinism, our first incompatibilist view, and classic compatibilism, our first compatibilist view. Okay, so we've looked at the first two camps. We said hard determinism, that means it says you can't have free will. Classic compatibilism, which says, well, so long as you understand what freedom is, then we've got freedom. But the trouble with classic compatibilism is you still don't have alternative possibilities. That is, one thing that even classic compatibilists have to admit is there is only one thing that it is possibilities. That there is only one thing that it is possible for you to do at any moment, and it's what the laws of nature say that you will do. So, classic compatibilists just say that you don't need alternative possibilities. But the critics of compatibilism, like the hard determinists, say, yes, you do need to have alternative possibilities to have genuine free will. So the criticism of classic compatibilism is it doesn't allow you this, and this is necessary for deep freedom. That is Robert Kane's term. And deep freedom is freedom of choice where you have genuine options. And it's only if you have alternative possibilities that, that you have this deep freedom. So, if we take that seriously, then what do we do? Do we have to be hard determinists, which means we don't have freedom? Not necessarily. The alternative, of course, for an incompatibilist says you can't have both of them together. So, of course, one view is to say that you have determinism and you don't have free will. The other view, of course, is to say that we have free will and we don't have determinism. And that is what classic libertarianism is. Now, as Kane says, don't confuse this libertarianism with what we standardly think of as libertarianism, you know, like Ron Paul or whatever. That's a political view which basically says the government better stay out of my business. That has nothing to do with this libertarianism. This is just the idea that we have genuine alternative possibilities. Now, this sounds right. It sounds important that we have genuine alternative possibilities. So, for example, it sounds like for my raising my hand to be a genuinely free act, it has to be the case that I had the possibility not to raise my hand. And this seems to be ruled out by classic compatibilism. Well, classic compatibilism says, oh, no. According to our view, you could have raised for anything you do, you could have done otherwise. But even I, who are sympathetic to classic compatibilism, find this answer a little bit dubious. Because what they say is could have done otherwise means you could have done otherwise if the laws of nature, I'm going to abbreviate it like that, were different. So in other words, they say, in a sense, there is, and philosophers talk about possible worlds a lot, and I don't want to get too much into that, but they say there is a possible world where I don't raise my hand. So I raise my hand in this actual world. Is it possible that I could have not raised it? Yes, there is a possible world in which I don't raise my hand. And because that's a possible world, that proves that it's possible. But the catch is, in this possible world, the laws of physics are different from the way they are here. So, but what classical compatibilists have to admit is that given the laws of physics as they are, there's only one thing I could have done. And given the laws of physics, I couldn't possibly have not raised my hand. Now, libertarians say, well, then you have to be able to do both for you to be genuinely free. And therefore, that means determinism is false. Now, let's be careful about this. They don't mean determinism is completely false, doesn't apply. Descartes is a good example. Descartes would say, no, determinism is absolutely true for the physical world. So determinism is true for atoms. Determinism applies to Mars and the Mars rover. All of those follow absolutely the laws of physics. They can't deviate from what the laws of physics say they will do. Also, my body is made of atoms. That has to follow determinism too. But determinism does not apply to minds or souls. And this is a view shared by Immanuel Kant, who is another very great early modern philosopher. So you remember when we were doing Descartes, he talks about I am a thinking thing, it is a soul, it's this immaterial thing that doesn't have a location, it's completely different from my body. It shares none of the properties of my body, including it is not bound by the laws of nature. So my mind is not determined. It can genuinely do one thing or the other. It has absolute choice. That's the idea, after all. Well, there's a problem with this idea that is pointed out in the Stephen Law chapter. And that is, if my body is determined, then it doesn't really matter if my soul isn't determined, because my body still has to do what the laws of physics say. And if the laws of physics say that my arm will go up, my arm has to go up. So even if my mind existed as a separate thing and wasn't determined by the laws of physics, it couldn't stop my arm going up. It couldn't make my body break the laws of physics. My mind maybe would be totally free, but in that case, it would be kind of like my mind just watches as my body does what the laws of physics determine it to do. Suppose the laws of physics determine that I'm going to walk off a cliff. My mind could be saying, no, don't walk off that cliff, but it couldn't stop my body from doing it because it can't break the laws of physics. Breaking the laws of physics would be literally a miracle, and it can't do that any more than, suppose I jump off the building again. My mind can't decide to break the laws of physics that drag me to the ground at 10 meters per second squared or whatever it is. It just can't do it. So if my mind can't make me fly, it can't violate the laws of physics, and therefore if my body is determined by the laws of physics, my mind has to go along for the ride. And as it doesn't seem like that, it's not the case that our mind and our bodies part ways. It looks like maybe we don't have a soul, which is what Law is hinting at when he says maybe determinism proves that we don't have a soul. Okay, so that didn't work. At least it does. It's a very weird view. There are plenty of defenders of this kind of view, and they get very sophisticated, but we're just laying out the camps here. Now, in defense of, so the classical libertarians looks like it's going to be hard to defend this view. But in the incompatibilist camp, a very important argument is called, and this is an argument, so it's not a view. So each of these, let's use this color. Each of these represents a sort of position, a view. You could say, I'm a hard determinist in the same way that you could say I'm a socialist or something like that. I'm a classic compatibilist or I'm a new compatibilist. Now, each of these positions can defend themselves by giving certain arguments. And one argument that basically any incompatibilist can give is called the consequence argument. So this is a new challenge to the classic compatibilists' consequence argument. Now, there's a whole chapter in the Robert Kane book that I just gave you the beginning of, which is the consequence argument. And essentially the consequence argument says, if determinism is true, then my actions are a consequence of the state of the universe millions of years ago and the laws of physics also millions of years ago. As I have no control over the state of the universe millions of years ago, obviously I can't change the past, and as I have no control over the laws of physics, then I have no control over my actions. My actions are not up to me. Now this is a dangerous argument for compatibilists, because compatibilists said we can defend a kind of freedom that we value. That is what I call the control condition. We can defend a freedom that allows me to be in control of my actions. Whereas the consequence argument says, no, your actions aren't up to you if this is right. So what do you say to that? Well, in response, one other thing I should say before we get any further. Libertarianism, we looked at the classic libertarianism involving souls, but, and I said that rejected determinism in terms of minds and souls, but Descartes and Kant were perfectly okay with determinism applying to the material world. What if you said, okay, determinism doesn't even apply to the material world? Does indeterminism save freedom? And I'm going to put in parentheses, e.g., quantum mechanics. All right. You have probably heard that according to one interpretation of quantum mechanics, which is a theory of physics that has been generally accepted and studied since the early 20th century, at a very tiny level, at the quantum level, things happen that are undetermined. So, for example, radioactive decay is supposed to be an example of an undetermined process. Whether or not a particular particle will decay cannot be predicted. So that seems to show that determinism is not really true, even about the physical universe. There are some things that are literally impossible to predict. Does that solve the problem? Does that show that, okay, now we don't have to worry about whether or not determinism is compatible with free will, because determinism isn't true? Well, two reasons why that doesn't really get rid of the problem. The first reason is that determinism does seem to still apply at all but the very, very tiny level. So it's not as if things just happen at random. It's not as if, I think make my arm go up and then I just have to wait to see if it does it or doesn't do it, and it's totally random. No, there's perfectly predictable behavior at the macro level, which is, anything above subatomic. So even atoms behave in a determined way. It's only when you get super tiny that it gets weird. So determinism still appears to apply at the level that matters to us. But the other response to why indeterminism is not helpful is pointed out by the classic compatibilists. In particular, Hume pointed this out. They said, no, indeterminism is just randomness. and randomness is not freedom. Let me explain. So, suppose it's true that whether or not my arm goes up is affected by indeterminism. What would this mean? This would mean that I decide I want my arm to go up, and then it's just random whether or not it goes up. Does that give me choice about my arm? Absolutely not. This undermines the freedom that the classical compatibilist gave us. So indeterminism is incompatible with the control condition, as I called it. Incompatible with the control condition. Remember, when I was talking about classic compatibilists, they said not only is freedom compatible with determinism, it requires determinism, because otherwise, if it wasn't the case that my body obeyed the laws of nature and was predictable, then I wouldn't be able to do what I wanted. And this is exactly the same point. They're saying, all right, take away determinism. You don't have any control. Things that happen to you are just random. So you'd be like the Tourette sufferer, or someone who, like a friend of mine in grad school, used to have a kind of a twitch. And imagine he's walking down the road and somebody walks by and he twitches and smacks him in the face. Did he do that freely? Well, it was indetermined, so does that give him freedom? No, say the classic compatibilists. In fact, it undermines freedom. So now it looks like we've got a problem in both ways. According to the consequence argument, free will is incompatible with determinism. But according to the compatibilist, free will is incompatible with indeterminism. So if you can't have free will with determinism and you can't have free will with indeterminism, then it looks like you have to be an incompatibilist, because you can't have free will at all. You have to reject freedom. Basically, you have to disagree with the libertarians who say we have free will, and you've got to disagree with the classic compatibilists who say we don't have free will. Who say we have free will too. So both of these camps say that we have free will. It's just they mean something different by it. The classic compatibilists say free will is being able to do what you want. The classic libertarians say, no, that's not good enough. That's surface freedom. But what we want is deeper freedom, which is genuine possibilities, genuine alternative possibilities. So both of them are defending that we have freedom, but if they're right to say that determinism is incompatible with their kind of free will, and these guys are right to say that indeterminism is incompatible with their kind of free will, then you're not left with either kind of free will. That takes us to the hard incompatibilists. Now, the hard incompatibilists, so they're like the hard determinists, but the reason why they don't call themselves hard determinists anymore is because they don't believe in free will, so like the hard determinists, but they're not sure about determinism either. They don't know if determinism is true or not, but they say it doesn't matter. If determinism is true, we don't have free will. If determinism is not true, we don't have free will. So they're kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't. Basically, we don't have free will whatever happens. And a couple of contemporary people who are still alive who've argued for this is a guy called Galen Strawson. Galen Strawson is the son of a guy called P.F. Strawson, who actually was one of the new compatibilists, so he sort of rejected his dad's view. Dirk Pereboom is another one who wrote a book called Living Without Free Will. Galen Strawson has given an argument, like the consequence argument, only he calls it the basic argument. And he says this argument proves that we don't have free will without talking about determinism. So it says even if determinism is true or not, it doesn't matter. Either way, this argument shows that you don't have free will. So the basic argument says something like this. And it seems to be working from a kind of libertarian or alternative possibilities view of freedom. But essentially it says this. For any action you do to have been free, it has to be the case that it resulted from something that was under your control. So, why is it that a Tourette's sufferer swearing is not done freely? And everyone agrees that. A Tourette's sufferer, even the compatibilists say that, yes, well, if a Tourette's sufferer is swearing because of their condition, it's not done freely. So, of course, they're not responsible. Why not? Well, the answer that most of us would give is because they couldn't help it. They had no way of stopping themselves doing that. Okay, you compatibilists then, why is it that we should punish somebody who shoplifts? Answer, because they could have had some effect on that. But suppose you say, well, wait a minute. The reason they shoplift is because they have a character that is bad. They have a character that says that shoplifting is okay. Is that their fault? And a compatibilist would have to say, well, it is their fault if they could have changed their character. And we all think we can change our characters. For example, we think we can make ourselves into better people. That's what self-help books are about. Making yourself into a better person so you do better things, which implies you have control over what you're like. Okay, so the compatibilists say we can hold people responsible, not the people who have Tourette's because they couldn't control that, but people who shoplift, we can hold them responsible because they didn't have to be shoplifters. They could tell themselves, I don't want to be a shoplifter anymore, I'm going to change their ways. So, we're still suggesting that we have free will. But what he says is, but this leads to an infinite regress. That is, in order for my action to be free, it has to be the result of a character over which I have some control. Okay, how do I have control? By taking an action to shape my character. Well, but is that action that shapes my character freely done? Only if it results from a character that was free. But then, why is that character free? Because it was shaped by a free action. But how is that action free? Because it results from a free action. How is that from a free character? How is that character free? Shaped by a free action. So it's a chicken and egg situation. The only way an action is free is if it's done by a character, if it's caused by a character that is free. But the only way that a character is free is if it was shaped by an action that was free. And you can never get to the end of the chain. It's impossible. It's impossible to shape yourself. Essentially, the way you are, is ultimately going to be the result of things that are not under your control. Genetics, upbringing, biochemistry, all of those things are not under your control. So there's no way you could ever be free. It has similarities with the consequence argument, but it doesn't involve determinism. So that's the hard incompatibilist view. It suggests that it doesn't matter if determinism is true, we don't have free will. But the compatibilists have one more card up their sleeves, new compatibilism, and we'll get to that next. All right, so where were we? We've looked at the hard determinists who say determinism must be true, so therefore we don't have free will. Classic compatibilists say, wait a minute, the freedom that we care about is having control over our actions, being able to do what we want. And we know that we have that. If I want that donut, I can get it. And determinism is true, so clearly they are compatible. We are able to do that. It's doing what you want. Then we had the response, classic libertarians said, but that's not good enough because there is this other element to freedom that gives us deeper freedom that requires alternative possibilities. Because if I genuinely had no option about doing what I'm doing, then it seems odd to punish me for it. It seems odd to reward me for it. It seems like you need alternative possibilities for this deeper freedom that is necessary for responsibility. Then we saw the problems that classic compatibilist says indeterminism doesn't solve the problem because it takes away control. Determinism takes away alternative possibilities, but indeterminism takes away control. So either way you're going to lose out, and that kind of left us with the hard incompatibilists. So suppose the hard incompatibilists are right and we don't have free will. Where does that leave us? Does that mean that murderous Mick can't be punished? Well, one glib answer to that is, well, we can't help it. If determinism makes us punish him, we got to do it. So he's going to get punished because determinism is forcing us to do it. Now, of course, that again seems to confuse it with fatalism, because we are still able to decide not to punish him. That's part of what it is to be us. So a more interesting question is, can we defend punishing somebody if it really is the case that they had no option, that it's just the way they're made, that people just do the things they do because of the way the universe made them, because of what they're made of, because of their upbringing, and so on. And here you get into a very interesting field of philosophy that we don't have time to discuss in much detail, which is philosophy of punishment. That's a whole subdiscipline. And very briefly, there are different theories of punishment. So let's use this. Theories of punishment. Now, there is one theory of punishment that seems incompatible with the absence of free will, and that is retribution. So retribution, or retributivism, yes, I should call it retributivism, really. Let's see if I can change this. Retributivism, yeah. See, practice with changing grades on my grade card helps me change letters. Retributivism is the idea of giving people what they deserve. That is, if you do something wrong, then you deserve a certain kind of punishment. Now, a famous retributive principle is what's called lex talionis, which people are familiar with the Old Testament sounding version of it, which is an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. What most people don't know is that this, although this sounds rather brutal, is actually rather liberal, because in the before lex talionis, people were being killed for stealing a loaf of bread. So they were given much more punishment than they deserved. Whereas lex talionis, an eye for an eye, says you've got to be given proportional punishment. If you just steal a loaf of bread, then we can't kill you. Okay, but so retributivism says the wrongness of your action should determine the severity of your punishment, which I think we all agree. I mean, I think if somebody proposed execution for jaywalking, people would have a problem with it, even though I bet that would end jaywalking pretty quickly. People would say, you can't do that. That's not fair. And that fairness is a retributivist idea, because fairness is giving people what they deserve. Okay, retributivism doesn't seem compatible with the absence of free will. It seems like retributivism requires us to be free, because it's only fair to punish me for doing something if I could have not done it. If I had no control over doing it, again, back to the Tourette sufferer, you don't fine a Tourette sufferer for swearing. It would be unfair to fine a Tourette sufferer for swearing because they couldn't help it. And if murderous Mick literally couldn't help it, he had no alternative, then it doesn't seem fair to punish him under retributivism. But there are other theories, most notably deterrence. Deterrence is the idea that the justification for punishing somebody is the deterrent effect it has. And most people justify capital punishment according to this. They say, those people that defend capital punishment say, capital punishment saves lives, because if we didn't have capital punishment, more people would commit murders. So to execute murderers stops future murderers from murdering, because they say, well, I would kill somebody, but I don't know, I might get executed. Now, if that was true of capital punishment, if it really did have a deterrent effect, then that would be an argument for capital punishment. Sadly, numerous studies have shown that capital punishment does not have a deterrent effect. It has no different a deterrent effect from life in prison. So that's no argument for capital punishment. But you get the basic idea. Deterrence says that we should punish someone not because they deserve it, but to save others. That is, having punishment as an institution stops people from committing crimes. And this makes sense. Now, retributivist theories have a lot of retributivists have a lot of criticism with this. Most notably, a retributivist said, but if your only justification for punishment is the deterrent effect, then you don't care if you punish someone who's innocent. Because punishing someone who's innocent and claiming that they're guilty has just as much deterrent effect as punishing someone guilty. Only we, say the retributivists, have this idea of desert, that punishment must be tied to the crime. Whereas deterrence, punishment isn't tied to the crime, it's tied to preventing future crimes. So there's interesting debate there that we can't really get into. But if you may have heard of a book and a movie called A Clockwork Orange. Believe it or not, that's a very philosophical movie. It's a very controversial movie. It was banned for decades in my country because it was said to have provoked copycat attacks. If you've seen the movie, the young hoodlums dress in a certain kind of way, and a gang of kids dressed in that kind of way had committed various crimes, so they pulled the movie in England. But anyway, A Clockwork Orange actually makes a very important philosophical point, and it's arguing for retributivism. It's saying you can't, even for someone as despicable as Alex, the main character, played very memorably by Malcolm McDowell. It is a great movie. Even someone like Alex, you cannot punish them just in a way that is convenient to the state. You have to treat them as a human being. All right, so deterrence. Then there's another justification, which is rehabilitation. That is rehabilitation. And there's a movement for replacing sending drug addicts to prison with sending them into treatment that has exactly this kind of justification. The point of punishment shouldn't be to punish the criminal. It should be to turn them into the kind of person who won't be a criminal. After all, why don't we commit crimes? Because we've had a good upbringing, because we've been protected, because we had advantages that maybe they didn't. So let's try to turn them into the kind of people that our good environment turned us into. It's not their fault that they became bad. They were just a product of a bad upbringing. So let's fix them. That's the idea of rehabilitation. And actually something like that is really the target of Clockwork Orange, because they basically change Alex by injecting him with drugs so that he literally cannot commit crimes. But it takes away his free will, so that the movie assumes that we do have free will. Anyway, rehabilitation, and finally prevention. So deterrence, I punish you to deter others from committing crime. Prevention, if I lock you away, then one thing we know for sure is that you can't commit crimes because you're not out on the streets. So prevention prevents the criminal themselves. Deterrence is trying to prevent other people from committing crimes. So these kinds of theories of punishment are compatible with us not having free will, and they are justifiable with us not having free will. Retributivists would say, no, there's something wrong with each of these because they don't respect us as humans. But if the assumption of retributism is that we have free will, and that's what's wrong with these, that they don't respect our free will, then if we don't have free will, maybe there's nothing wrong with these. Yes, this is mentioned in the chapter on hard determinism in the Bob Kane book. He talks about Schumann's quarantine analogy. That would be prevention. So punishment, just as we quarantine people with Ebola, if someone has Ebola or leprosy, we quarantine them, we keep them away from the rest of the population. And if you're in New Zealand, someone with COVID-19 is kept away from the rest of the population. So we should do the same with criminals. Or like, you know, dangerous animals should be locked away. Well, we're just like dangerous animals on this view. Now, that's not a very nice view of us. And a classic compatibilist would say that's taking away our valued freedom, our freedom to do what we want. Okay, so is there a compatibilist response to this? Well, the compatibilist response of the new compatibilists is a couple of ingenious arguments that says that actually this is not required for freedom. And if this is not required for freedom, then we're back to compatibilism, because control is compatible with determinism. So the arguments go like this. Dennett's argument involves a Martin Luther quote. Oh, I'm going to run out of space on it, so here we go. Martin Luther. Now, that's not Martin Luther as in Martin Luther King. It's Martin Luther as in the person Martin Luther King was named after. And Martin Luther is the founder of Protestantism, or one branch of Protestantism, Lutheranism, which is still popular in parts of the Midwest. Martin Luther famously objected to what he saw as the corruption of the Catholic Church at the time, so hence launching an alternative to the Catholic Church, which is Protestantism. And he's famous for nailing his sort of list of complaints about the Catholic Church. There's 96, was it, theses of what's wrong with the way the Catholic Church was doing things to the door of a cathedral. And he is famously regarded as someone, this is considered incredibly shocking what he's doing. He's going against the church and he's a committed Christian. How can you go against the church and be a committed Christian? And his answer was, he's so driven by his commitment to what he thinks is right that he literally had to do it. He had to do it. And his famous quote is, "Here I stand, I can do no other." Well, at least that's the translation of it, because he didn't speak English. Here I stand, I can do no other. Which sounds an awful lot like he literally had no choice. He had no alternative but to do what he was doing. Why did he have no alternative? Because of the way he was, because of his morality. I mean, you probably know someone. There are some people like that who literally can't lie because they can't bring themselves to, or can't be rude to someone. Maybe you've got an old granny who literally can't not be nice to everybody. I love my granny, but she wasn't like that. But maybe you know someone like that. Then there are people like that. Saintly people are people who literally can't help but do good. Would we say that those saintly people are not free? No, says Dennett. We would say absolutely they're free. The fact, even if it's true, literally true, that Martin Luther couldn't but do what he did, we wouldn't say that that took away his freedom. So then it sounds like you don't need alternative possibilities. even if he had to do that and he had no possibility of not doing that, we would still say he was free in doing it. That's Dennett's argument. Frankfurt, Harry Frankfurt, one of America's most famous still living philosophers, he hit the bestseller lists a few years ago because he published a short book called On Bullshit. And it was a serious philosophical treatment of bullshit. But I have a sneaking suspicion that it hit the bestseller list because of the word bullshit. But still, it's good philosophy. Harry Frankfurt has this, he's at Princeton still, I think. Dennett is at Tufts. His most famous example from a paper involving about alternative possibilities is he argues that the requirement that you have alternative possibilities to be morally responsible is unnecessary. And his case is the Mr. Black, the neurosurgeon, the evil neurosurgeon. Now, he doesn't actually specify that he's a neurosurgeon, but I'm going to put it that way. So here's the case. Suppose Mr. Black hates Mr. Pink. I'm making this up. The name Mr. Black and Mr. Brown are used by Frankfurt, but I'm making up Mr. Pink. It's a Reservoir Dogs reference, if you've seen that. I can't actually remember who's who in that movie, but it's the best Quentin Tarantino movie. Don't listen to anybody who says different. Anyway, Mr. Black hates Mr. Pink, and he wants him killed. Now, Mr. Black also knows that Mr. Brown hates Mr. Pink. Got that? So Mr. Black wants Mr. Pink dead, but he doesn't want to get his hands dirty. And he knows that Mr. Brown also hates Mr. Pink. And he thinks there's a good chance that Mr. Brown will kill Mr. Pink. But he wants to make sure. So, being an evil neurosurgeon, while Mr. Brown is asleep, he plants a chip in Mr. Brown's head. And what this chip will do is, if Mr. Brown decides not to kill Mr. Pink, then it will force Mr. Brown to kill Mr. Pink. But if Mr. Brown kills Mr. Pink of his own free will, the chip does nothing, and in fact, it harmlessly dissolves, and it's as if it was never there. Okay, so what Mr. Black knows is that now Mr. Brown is going to kill Mr. Pink, because either Mr. Brown will choose to do it, in which case the chip does nothing, or Mr. Brown will choose not to do it, in which case the chip will force him to kill Mr. Pink. So either way, Mr. Pink is dead. Now, what happens? Well, what happens is Mr. Brown decides to kill Mr. Pink and does so. So the chip does nothing. What's the point of all this? The point of all this is, because of the chip in Mr. Brown's head, he didn't have any alternative possibilities. That is, he had to kill Mr. Pink. If he'd have killed Mr. Pink, if he decided not to kill Mr. Pink, the chip would have made him do it. It would have programmed him. Another great movie, while I'm recommending great movies, what have we got so far? We've got A Clockwork Orange, we've got Reservoir Dogs. Now, Manchurian Candidate. Don't watch the remake with Denzel Washington. I love Denzel Washington, but the original is better. And it's got Frank Sinatra in it. Anyway, in Manchurian Candidate, somebody gets... More startlingly for modern viewers is it's got, what's her name from Murder, She Wrote? Angela Lansbury. And she plays someone really evil. So it's kind of funny to watch a nice old lady from Murder, She Wrote, who is still alive, Mrs. Potts from Beauty and the Beast. She's still alive. She must be nearly 100. But she plays someone truly evil in this movie. So it's worth seeing for that. Anyway, in Manchurian Candidate, somebody is basically brainwashed into committing an assassination. Essentially, that's what would have happened to Mr. Brown, but it wasn't necessary because he chose to do so of his own free will. So, is Mr. Brown responsible for killing Mr. Pink? And I think everyone would agree, yes, he is. Why is he responsible for killing Mr. Pink? because he chose to do so. He did indeed chose to do so, and he did it, and the chip was not necessary. But notice what this proves. It proves that you can be responsible for doing something even when you don't have any alternative, because he didn't have any alternative. If he'd have chosen not to kill Mr. Pink, he would have been forced to do it anyway. So he had no alternative possibilities, and yet he was responsible. So consequently, what the Dennett and Frankfurt new compatibilist examples seem to show is that you can have the kind of freedom that is required for responsibility without alternative possibilities. So maybe there's hope. Maybe we don't have to just lock people away like mad animals, and maybe we can be held morally responsible. Well, the hard determinists and the libertarians are not going to be convinced, but I'm going to leave it there. That seems like enough for this unit.